mają wywalić stąd. Wynocha stąd, wziąć. Panoszy. Mucha. Da się panuszyć. O, poleciała. Dobra.
Please be seated, get your headsets. If you need Polish translation, come to the front, please. The front row is still available. Dzień dobry, proszę, poczekam aż wszyscy wejdą. Będę mówił po angielsku. Przepraszam moich polskich przyjaciół i kolegów. Chciałbym tylko wyjaśnić.
Are pictures from the book mainly and from my research. They're just, given that our subject today is the Soviet attack on eastern Poland, 17th of September, they're not strictly relevant. They are all from the September campaign generally, but they're there more to sort of give us an appropriate atmosphere and a bit of sort of wallpaper, as it were, for what I'm going to say. So there's nothing sort of specifically relevant. A few of those images you will know, and a few of them are relevant to what we're talking about as well. But they're not sort of. I'm not going to be pointing up at the screen. I should just, before I start, I should just introduce the book to you in a rather shameless kind of self-promoting kind of way. It's just come out, actually. Both the UK and Polish editions have just come out. It's on the September campaign, so it gives you, the background of the diplomacy, but the essence of it is 1st of September up to the 6th of October, so the end of the September campaign. And those of us, I'm sure, those of you who've researched your sort of family histories and so on, and that's very often the main reason you're here, I know, you will appreciate how, for us, particularly Brits, and also I think it goes for the Americans as well, how this is almost a completely unknown subject in the sort of general historiography of the war. So in the British narrative, this, the September campaign is usually passed over in a couple of paragraphs in the standard histories. It's usually passed over with all the usual mythology in place, i.e. cavalry versus tanks, all the sort of cavalry myth comes out. And the other great myth, of course, that they include is the Soviet myth that the Red Army wasn't there at all, that the Red Army didn't invade Poland in 1939. So for me, that was one of the main reasons to try and write the book. First of all, you want to try and, fill the gap. You've got a massive gap in the literature. You've got the opening campaign of the war, which lasts for over 5 weeks, costs something like 200,000 lives, and yet it gets passed over in the narrative in about 2 paragraphs. And there's a story there to be told that is not being told. So that was my primary intention, was to fill that gap. And the secondary intention is to challenge those mythological narratives. to say, look, you know, Polish cavalry really didn't charge tanks. That is wartime Nazi propaganda. It's nonsense. And that we're still talking about it in 2019 is ridiculous. So try and get to the bottom of that myth, where the myth came from, and to try and disprove it, which is not that difficult to do. And of course, that other mythology, you know, challenged the mythology. The Soviets weren't there. So I wanted to make a highlight in the book was to talk about the Soviet invasion of September 17th and the aftermath. And the last intention on the book was really to essentially put the Polish voice back into the story of September 39. Because in the English-speaking narrative, it's been left out. Where it's written about at all, which is hardly anywhere, it's written from the perspective of agonizing Western politicians saying, oh dear, we have to go to war because we've made this commitment to Poland, but we can't really do anything. It's all of that stuff, Whitehall agonizing. Or, if you have a particularly adventurous Western historian, they might use the memoirs of someone like Heinz Guderian and use his propaganda memoir. So you've got either a Westminster British view, very Anglo-centric, or you've got a German view, coloured by their own propaganda. But the Poles are almost completely absent in their own narrative. So you can see how that was another objective for the book, was to try and put the Poles back into their narrative of World War II, particularly of the opening campaign. So, just to do the last bit of the shameless plug, that's the UK edition, First to Fight, the Polish War 1939, and that's the Polish edition, which is out in the shop over there at a bargain price, 20% off. I'm available for signatures later. So that's the Polish edition. Right, okay, on to September 17th. Some of you might have heard about 3 years ago, in 2016, a Russian blogger by the name of Vladimir Luzgin was prosecuted by a court in Moscow for spreading a Ukrainian, he had retweeted, or whatever it is they do, he'd passed on a Ukrainian post on social media which had basically said that the Red Army invaded Poland on the 17th of September. And Luzgin was hauled up in Moscow and prosecuted, and he was found guilty, and he was fined the equivalent in rubles of about £2,500, so maybe 10,000 zloty. And the charge that he was prosecuted under was that of glorifying Nazism, for telling the truth. Very peculiar situation pertaining in modern Russia. Essentially, the Soviet narrative, as you will all know, of September 17th, is that the Red Army was kind of not there at all. It was a humanitarian intervention. This was the propaganda narrative that was given at the time. A humanitarian intervention where the Red Army came in to try and protect Ukrainian and Belarusian nationalities in eastern Poland, protect them from the consequences of Poland's political and military collapse. That's the narrative that they gave. And that, of course, we know is nonsense. And I track where that narrative came from, how it develops. I track that in the book. But that's the one that they've kind of stuck with ever since, that this wasn't a military operation, it wasn't an invasion. And the key thing is that Stalin's political neutrality in the opening phase of the war in 1939 is so central, is so crucial to his sort of game, to his world plan, his strategic plan, that it could not be risked by an open collaboration with Hitler. That was the problem. He is, of course, Hitler's collaborator. We know that. But he can't risk openly collaborating with Hitler. So he has to wait, he says, until he's constantly communicating with Moscow, between Moscow and Berlin, and they're saying, well, you let us know when Warsaw is going to fall. When the Polish capital falls, we can say that Poland has collapsed. And the Germans say to them, well, we're on the outskirts of Warsaw, it will take a few more days. And that's where Stalin actually miscalculates. He gives the order to invade on the 17th of September, and of course, as we know, Warsaw doesn't fall until the 28th. So it's another full 10 days after his invasion. But still, he managed to get away with it. He got away with this sort of propaganda narrative that he hadn't invaded Poland at all. If you look at British school textbooks, if you look at British history textbooks, if you look at British popular history, almost any form of history book in the UK, and I think by extension in the US, you will not see references to the Red Army invasion of Poland. It's like the greatest posthumous success that Stalin could possibly have wished for, is that he managed to write himself out of the narrative of 1939. So that's what we're battling against. That's what we're trying to correct. So the truth is, of course, again, as you all know, is that this is very much a military campaign. This is very much a military invasion by the Soviets in 1939. They had been carrying out military exercises on the eastern Polish frontier for about most of the previous week prior to the 17th of September. Their instruction from the Chief of Staff, Boris Shaposhnikov, was to carry out a lightning strike, to effect the swift destruction of Polish forces. That doesn't sound like a humanitarian operation to me. They massed about 500,000 troops, 500,000 troops, 5,000 tanks, about 2,500 aircraft. Again, doesn't sound much like a humanitarian operation. So it's very obviously, from the outset, a military invasion. And what are the Polish response? The Polish response was very mixed. Most of those Polish troops that immediately met the Soviets on the dawn on the 17th of September were troops or soldiers of the KOP, the KOP, the Border Defence Force, which was effectively, to put it bluntly, glorified policemen. They didn't have artillery, they didn't have air cover, they didn't have armour. They were a group or organisation that had been set up in the 1920s to effectively police what was a very long and very lawless frontier with the Soviet Union. So they were well equipped for sort of minor incursions, but they couldn't deal with a full-scale military invasion, and that's what they had to deal with on the 17th of September. To add to their problem, the KOP were ordered not to engage with Soviet forces. There is a tremendous sort of resulting confusion across many of these units in eastern Poland at dawn on the 17th of September. A lot of those units melt away. A lot of them, of their own volition, realise they're up against a vastly superior enemy, and they pull away anyway and melt away as best they can. A lot of them don't have the option, and they're forced to fight. And others are simply confused. And I'll go into the confusion in a minute, because a lot of it was deliberately sown by the Soviets. But that confusion of the opening morning of the campaign is actually kind of well summarised by one particular event, which I will read to you, which we discovered in the archive. I'll just read you this paragraph. It's rather telling. The confusion of those first hours of the Soviet invasion was typified by an exchange between the KOP regimental commander in Chortkov, Colonel Marceli Kotarba, and the General Staff. When he was asked to send an emissary to the Soviets to discover their intentions, Kotarba replied that all my battalions are fighting and 2 Soviet tanks have already been destroyed. I doubt whether I'll be able to fulfill the order regarding the envoy. Undeterred, the General Staff insisted that an emissary should be sent, to which Kotarba responded, Soviet planes over Chortkov. A further demand that talks with the Soviets should be opened was met with the answer, air raid, I must go. The next question neatly encapsulated Poland's predicament. The question from the General Staff was, is this raid by German or Soviet planes? So it rather sums up Poland's position and the confusion of that opening morning of the war. In spite of that confusion and the fact that a lot of KOP units had already withdrawn of their own volition, there is still a number of instances of very stiff resistance being given to the Soviets on that first morning of the war, of the Eastern campaign, at places like Dzisna and Hushatin, particularly Litsani, right in the center of the Eastern frontier, close to the Pripyat marshes. Sarny was something like a 3-day battle because the Poles had actually had a network of bunkers constructed and earthworks constructed at Sarny, which they could adequately defend. But they eventually fell after a couple of days, but they were very bitterly defended. And later in the campaign, of course, there's the defense of Wilno, which is quite extended, and most notably that of Grodno. So in spite of the fact that Polish forces were outnumbered and very much outgunned, they did put up a stiff resistance in a number of examples, and that, I think, is to their credit. A word should probably be mentioned about Soviet methods, because this is quite an important aspect of the story. Those of you that remember the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 will remember these sort of lines that we learned. We learned new terms in the West, little green men and disinformation and maskirovka and all of these sort of techniques that, to those that maybe hadn't been paying attention, seemed like a new concept in warfare. But in many ways, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a sort of, Eastern Ukraine, was a sort of a repeat of what Red Army and Soviet soldiers had been doing for a long time prior to that, which is using all of those weapons in the armory of disinformation particularly, and camouflage and agence provocateur and all of this. And all of this you see also in the September campaign in 1939. So in the first category of disinformation, desinformacja, one of the most obvious things that they did was to distribute leaflets behind the Polish lines, which often had very conflicting messages. So one of the sort of favorite narratives that they gave was that the Red Army was coming to liberate local populations. It didn't necessarily say who those populations were, but it said it was coming to liberate you from your property, mostly, but liberate you from your liberty. And if you're a Ukrainian or Belarusian, you understood this as being liberated from the Polish state. Okay? So it could almost mean all things to all men. Another message that they propagated at the time was that they were coming to aid Poland against the Germans. So you can see how this deliberate sowing of confusion is one of the factors that actually inhibits the creation of any sort of coherent Polish defense, even if that were possible. So there are a number of instances, for example, where Polish garrisons and Polish forces actually welcome the Red Army in the expectation that they are going to march together against the Germans. And a number of instances that I describe in the book, where they're welcomed in, and then, of course, the next moment, they find themselves at gunpoint and are promptly arrested. In one instance, a Red Army band actually played the unit it was with across the border, playing "We of the 1st Brigade," you know, the Polish patriotic military hymn, as a way of, again, confusing the defence, making sure that the defence was not able to respond in a properly military, proper defensive manner. And then, of course, there's the maskirovka, the use of deception, the use of false flag operations. In a number of instances, one that I discovered in the archive, which was particularly interesting, was the suggestion that there were Red Army soldiers in Polish uniforms who were sort of combing the area behind the line as the Red Army advanced, and looking for people, putting the word out that they were looking for people to come and fight the bloody Soviets, come and fight the Russians. And then as soon as Polish soldiers, many of whom had melted away in the first moments of that engagement, they would sort of come forward and say that they're ready to fight the Soviets, and then at that point they'd be taken away and they'd disappear. So again, it does look like it's a sort of a false flag operation, a way of trying to weed out people who are of a mind to resist from the local population. So all sorts of very cunning and dastardly methods being used. What the Soviets bring with them, of course, is effectively class war. So we know very well that the Germans in Western Poland, in their half of Poland that they have ascribed to themselves with the Nazi-Soviet Pact and the secret protocol, in that area they are already committing what we can describe as race war against ordinary Poles, to an increasing degree also against Polish Jews. That part of the narrative is quite well known, particularly in the Western chronology, in the Western story of the war. But the idea that the Soviets are effectively doing or carrying out similar operations, similar methods, but with a different ultimate rationale, i.e. class war versus race war, is something that's very much unknown, I think, in the Western narrative. It won't be particularly new to you, I'm sure. But this is carried out in a number of ways. In the first example, they tend to go in, and wherever they arrive, the Red Army sets up militias. It sets up militias of concerned citizens who, as one of the voices that I use in the book, describes these militias as usually the very lowest of the low. They are escaped prisoners, they are criminals, they are exactly not the sort of people that you want to be wielding power in the aftermath of great upheaval. But they are the people who don the red armband and then go around and terrorize their own populations. So a lot of those early atrocities against particularly Polish populations in eastern Poland, landlords, nobles, merchants, anyone involved with the local administration, for example, a lot of the first atrocities against those people are carried out by these militias. There's another wonderful quote. This is the Red Army actually consciously not just allowing these atrocities to happen, but actually actively encouraging them. There's another quote I would want to read to you, which describes that quite well. In the village of Maszów, near Kovel, a Soviet lieutenant made a speech in the main square, in which he called upon the people to go and take what rightfully belonged to them, to avenge the pain of 20 years of exploitation, proclaiming that they should kill and take the property of those who had filled their pockets and filled their barns with your blood. So you can see in that example that they are not just allowing these atrocities to happen, they are actively trying to propagate them. So those atrocities would then be carried out. That restitution, that revenge, in inverted commas, would then be carried out primarily by the Soviet-created militias. So it's an active incitement to violence, effectively. And the result was very often fatal for those who were on the receiving end. There are numerous examples that I quote in the book. One of a local voivod who had the misfortune to have misread the signals from the Red Army, rode out on his horse to meet the column of Red Army soldiers, was kicked to the floor, dragged away, and was later shot. There's also a story of a president of the local court in Pinsk who was tied by his feet to a wagon, and then the wagon was driven around the streets of Pinsk until he breathed his last. So the number of examples of that sort of deliberate targeting, already in September 39, that deliberate targeting of local prominence and local authorities. The Red Army itself also actively participated in this, as they would have put it, class-based cleansing of Polish society, of Kresy society. One of the best examples that seems to be borne out, I've heard of a number of cases of this, one of the best tactics that they used was to look at the hands of their prisoners when they rounded them up. So they had large groups of prisoners. A lot of the Polish officers particularly realized fairly swiftly that this was not going to end particularly well if you were an officer and probably also an aristocrat. So they tended to pull off any of their sort of marks of insignia and marks of rank as best they could and pose as ordinary soldiers. And the Red Army got wise to this, and the Red Army would then get all of the prisoners to show their hands. And of course, if you had nice calloused peasant hands, then there's a good chance that you were just a farmer or you were an industrial worker perhaps, but chances are you were just a farmer and you would be fairly safe. If you had nice, white, soft hands like mine, what they described as bieloruchki, then you were in trouble because you were either a dangerous bourgeois or an intellectual. So those people would then be taken off for what they would call enhanced interrogation, which for many of whom, of course, as we know, that interrogation process would have ended in the death pits of Katyn. The Red Army also carries out a number of massacres of its own. It doesn't even wait for those prisoners to be handed over to the NKVD and be dealt with at Katyn the following year. There are a number of massacres carried out by the Red Army in this period. One notable one at Mokrany, which was a battle that involved the remnants of the Pinsk river flotilla, which we heard about yesterday in that presentation about Pinsk and Polessia. The river flotilla had already scuppered its boats quite early in the campaign because it realized that they were not going to be terribly useful, so they'd already gone effectively as ordinary troops on foot, most of them. They ended up fighting alongside, firstly, General Orlik Rukoman, and then later with General Kleberg. And the very last stand of the September campaign, on the 6th of October, the Battle of Kotsk, which is not far from the Vistula, south of Warsaw, that included the last members of the Pinsk riverine flotilla. So they got all the way to Kotsk before they finally were obliged to surrender. And in that example, obliged to surrender to the Germans. But earlier on, that same unit, or part of that unit, had been fighting at a place called Mokrany, which is now, I think, western Belarus. And they had been forced to surrender. Again, the officers had been separated from the men. The officers were led away. And as the men were being taken away, they heard gunshots. And one of the men asked his Red Army guard and said, what's going on? Are we still fighting? And the guard said, no, those are your officers. Those are your masters killed in Mokrany forest. So it's very obvious that they are bringing class war, class revolution to eastern Poland. Another great example is that of the commander of the defense of Grodno, General Olszyna Wilczyński, who rounded up a tremendous force actually in the defense of Grodno, consisting of scouts and all sorts of other sort of ragtag units that he could round up. And they defended Grodno for 3 days, which was quite a remarkable feat. At the end of that, he tried to escape to Lithuania. His staff car was stopped by the Red Army. He was promptly identified, in spite of the fact he was traveling with his wife, incidentally. But he was identified very quickly and taken out and shot by the side of the road. And I think the most telling example is one, I forget where this was from, I think it was Rovno, was of a KOP officer who was summarily executed upon capture. And the line that was given at the moment of his execution was, "That will teach you to be an officer." So it's very clear that the officer corps is being targeted already in September 39. We know, of course, that it's targeted later on with the Katyn massacres and that sort of generalized decapitation of Polish society that both the Germans and the Soviets are doing through that awful winter of 39-40. But it's interesting that they are doing that in a very concentrated and determined manner already in September 39 as well. What about the question of Soviet-German collaboration? This is another one that is, I think, very interesting. It's quite telling. Of course, they go into Poland as collaborators. They have signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact on the 23rd of August. That included, as you will know, I've spoken about the Nazi-Soviet Pact before, but the Nazi-Soviet Pact itself is a non-aggression pact. It's very similar to all the other non-aggression pacts that were signed by various forces, various countries in the 1930s. This is always the argument of even current Russian propaganda, is that the Nazi-Soviet pact is just another non-aggression pact. But that's just to conveniently ignore the fact that the secret protocol to the Nazi-Soviet pact is where all the interesting material is. That's where the Central Europe is effectively divided up between those two powers. So according to the secret protocol to the Nazi-Soviet pact, Central Europe is divided, and those two powers, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, effectively begin to collaborate. And that's what happens after 1939, after the 1st of September. So the Germans, of course, came first, 1st of September, and actually the Germans are the first even to reach the Kresy. So German spearheads both from north and from the south. The north is Guderian's Third Army from memory, which pushes very far east and actually besieges Brest already in, I think, about the 17th of September, I think 16th or 17th, is already besieging Brest. And the same thing in the south. The German 14th Army, and particularly the mountain troops, make a race to capture Lvov and actually reach Lvov long before the Soviets as well. So the first foreign troops to enter the Kresy are actually Germans. Now, the way that sort of collaboration between the two was supposed to run was that they were always to keep this distance from one another. They were supposed to keep a 25-kilometer distance between Soviet and German troops. This was the arrangement. And this is why there are comparatively few pictures that you will see of German and Soviet troops openly mingling in 1939. I mean, we've all probably seen the pictures, and there's probably only maybe a dozen in total. There's a few pictures of the joint parade at Brest-Litovsk. There's a couple of pictures in Lvov. There's not much else. And this is explained by that fact that their agreement was they were supposed to keep a 25-kilometer distance from one another. And this goes back to what I mentioned about Stalin and his obsession with this idea that he had to maintain his political neutrality, the image, the illusion of political neutrality. So he didn't want to have his soldiers photographed shaking hands with the Germans, because that damaged that political illusion of neutrality. That said, there are a number of examples that I mentioned in the book where there are actually skirmishes between German and Soviet troops, where they come together. They actually had to make some arrangement for sort of rules of engagement. So the Germans, for example, asked the Soviets not to operate by night, because that was a favoured tactic of the Poles. So if they sort of get wind of military movements at night, they want to be able to assume it's the Poles and not the Soviets. So there are various sort of localized agreements whereby they could actually set rules of engagement between the two. And there are a number of skirmishes. There's one just outside Lvov, a place called Viniki, where the two sides come to blows. A couple of tanks are destroyed, a number of people are killed, and then they manage to separate. And the same thing, not long after, I think, the Battle of Shatsk further north from Lvov, where they come to blows as well. So there's a couple of examples where this relationship, this collaboration, does rather spectacularly fail. There is actually, and it comes across very strongly, I think, in the materials that I saw, there seems to be a very strong fear and distrust of each side. It's very difficult for both sides, having spent the previous 6 years in the German case or beyond, fulminating against one another, insulting each other as best they could, seeing the other side as the political opposite of themselves, as the political devil incarnate. It's very difficult to change people's minds in the space of a week between the 23rd of August and the outbreak of war. And as Khrushchev says in his memoir, he talks about going out or being part of this operation to try and convince ordinary Soviet civilians of the rightness of this move, the Nazi-Soviet pact, and this arrangement with Nazi Germany. And he says, well, it didn't work. How could you possibly explain to the Soviet people that after everything we'd said about Hitler and everything we'd said about the Nazis, that we were now friends with them and we were now collaborating with them? It was an impossible sell. So he actually says that in his memoir. So a lot of the Soviet troops certainly are actually rather confused as to why they're there, which is quite interesting. So that comes to some details that come out of the Soviet archives, or Russian archives, that show you that they are confused. They say, well, what are we doing? Why? We're not an imperialist power. Why is the Soviet Union invading another country? This is not what we do. They'd obviously swallowed the Soviet propaganda. So there's a lot of confusion even amongst Red Army soldiers as to what they're doing there. And that confusion is probably not helped by that deliberate disinformation that I mentioned on an official level, in terms of the messaging that was given, the propaganda message, the leafleting that was sending 3 different messages at the same time. So I think the result was to compound that confusion on the part of ordinary soldiers. And there are a number of instances on the German side as well, where the Germans seem to have been profoundly fearful of the Red Army. And in a couple of instances, they actually try and persuade Polish populations where they've gone beyond the demarcation line. They actually try and persuade Polish populations to come with them when they withdraw, because they say the Russians are coming and this won't be pretty. So that's an interesting sort of sidelight into this rather difficult relationship between the two. The best example, of course, of that collaboration is the joint parade at Brest-Litovsk on the 22nd of September 1939. The city had, of course, been invested, had been besieged by General Guderian, coming down from the north out of East Prussia, and had then had to be handed over to the Soviets. And Guderian and Krivoshin, who was his counterpart, you saw the picture yesterday, I think, on one of the slideshows, and it's running up there as well, so I'm sure you'll see it in a moment. You know, there's wonderful sort of newsreel footage, there's lots of still footage of this joint parade between Red Army and Wehrmacht troops in the streets of Brest-Litovsk, where essentially the Germans handed over the city to Soviet control. So they both had a joint parade, and then they brought down the swastika, raised the red flag of the Soviet Union, and the German forces under Guderian then withdrew westwards, leaving Brest in Soviet hands. So that's the sort of best, most public example of this open collaboration. But as I said, it's quite a rare example, and it's particularly rare because it is, you know, on newsreel and lots of sort of still photographs and all of that. In general, they tended to keep away from one another for political reasons. So what's the significance of this Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939? One of the points that's often raised is that the timing of Stalin's invasion determined or was determined by the lack of action by the Western Allies in the West. And this is one that is quite complex. I think that just to read that as a sort of a linear development, that because the West didn't act robustly in the early weeks of September, that allows Stalin to do what he did when his invasion on the 17th, is a bit too simplistic. I think we have to understand that there are lots of other factors that influence Stalin's timing in his decision to invade. Not least the fact that he has an ongoing battle in Manchuria against the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, which is only ended on the 16th of September, so that's the day before his invasion of westward into Poland. And also, of course, that I don't think Stalin would necessarily have been deterred by Western inaction, or even, by Western robust action in 1939, because, of course, in a grand strategic sense, this is what Stalin wanted. He wanted the Western powers and the Germans to be fighting. So this actually would have fitted his grand narrative of the reasoning for the Nazi-Soviet pact. It would have fitted that narrative rather well. So I think it's rather too simplistic just to, in a sense, blame Stalin's invasion on Western inaction at the opening stage of the war. So that's one point. The narrative that the Soviets gave, and by extension now the Russians give, that Poland had already collapsed by the 17th of September is also rather nonsensical and fundamentally untrue. The Polish army is still in the field. It is still fighting on the 17th of September. The Polish government is still on Polish soil, crucially, on the 17th of September. Only just, but it is. There would have been some possibility that Polish forces might have fought better, might have rallied, possibly, without the Soviet invasion, if they'd had that hinterland of the Kresy to reform, to actually gather their forces to resist the Germans a little bit better. That's a bit of an open question. I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting proposition. But the point is that the Polish army is still in the field, the Polish government is still on Polish soil, Poland has not collapsed. Warsaw doesn't fall for another 10 days. So there's a lot more there to consider as well. We have to understand, I think, that Red Army invasion does obviously hasten, does speed up Poland's collapse. So it's not the result of Poland's collapse in 1939, it's the cause of it, effectively. So Stalin's invasion really does finish off Polish resistance in 1939, even though, of course, they fight on for another couple of weeks. But it crucially destroys that escape effort down through the Romanian bridgehead, down to the southeast, Poland's only relatively friendly frontier at the time. The Red Army advance, those spearheads heading westwards across the Polish frontier, do very strongly disrupt that evacuation to the southeast, makes that very, very difficult. So it certainly prevents larger numbers of Poles, Polish troops, civilians, administrators, politicians, whoever it is, from escaping down through Romania. So that certainly has that effect as well. And of course, as we all know, the end result of the Soviet invasion is then the annexation of Eastern Poland into the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics, their complete communization, and of course the restoration of that frontier post-war under Stalin, and that is still the frontier today, as you well know. A lot of audiences would be surprised at that, but you wouldn't be, I know. I'll go back to this point about the lack of knowledge of this in the West. It was very interesting yesterday on an opening lecture with Dr. Kuba Kozłowski, and a line that he used, which I thought was rather neat. He said that we feed on simplified myths in our public history. And I think that's absolutely right. We all have rather essentially simplified narratives of all of our own histories. But I think it's most peculiar in the British case with this story, particularly with World War II, because it's so central to how we view ourselves as a nation. It's so central to how we picture our own national story. And yet we have such a really peripheral and sort of tentative understanding of it, the whole history of World War II. So our British understanding of history rarely extends beyond the sort of textbook stuff, the sort of headline stuff of a D-Day, a Dunkirk, the Dam Busters, the Battle of Britain, all of that sort of thing. And actually anything, effectively anything beyond the centre of Europe is more or less a terra incognita for your average British reader. And that's even a British reader who understands a bit about history and reads about World War II. So you have to understand that our understanding of this collectively is very, very poor. Poland doesn't really feature in the British narrative of the war. It features in 1939. We know we go to war for Poland. We might even know that we don't do much in defense of Poland, to our shame. But beyond that, Poland sort of slips from the narrative. And it doesn't reappear, possibly with 303 Squadron in the Battle of Britain, possibly, as of the last few years, it possibly reappears with the Polish mathematicians and the Enigma story. It might reappear in Tobruk, it might reappear at Monte Cassino. That's about it. So Poland's fate, what happens in Poland itself, what happens in Poland through the war, even the Warsaw Rising of 1944, and particularly this story of 1939, is really off the map altogether, as far as most British readers are concerned. And it's, of course, this lack of knowledge that facilitates that propagation and continuation of the propaganda narratives. The German propaganda narrative about, cavalry against tanks, the blue-eyed, chisel-jawed German boys all in their tanks, and the foolish Poles on horseback. The implied racial superiority that is within that image, which is an important point behind it. And it enables that Russian disinformation, Soviet disinformation, by extension Russian disinformation, which says that the Red Army was never there at all, and only one country invaded Poland in 1939. Indeed, I would say if any of us, there's quite a few of us Brits here, if we went and walked down the street wherever we are, back home in Britain, and we asked people at random, how many countries invaded Poland in 1939? How many of them do you think, how many of those respondents do you think would say 2? Or even 3? Don't forget Slovakia. But how many of them would say 2? I don't think anyone would. They'd all know Germany, but they wouldn't know that the Soviet Union had invaded Poland as well. And that's a sort of grievous failing in our education system that really needs to be rectified. So this is changing. Poland is making its way slowly into the collective narrative. As I said, 303 Squadron, the Enigma mathematicians, this is slowly changing. It does take time, but it's not changing fast enough. And hopefully this book can start to awaken British readers, and by extension American readers, to the reality of the war in 1939 and what it meant for Poland. Interestingly, on this subject of September 17th, there's an opinion piece, as I've seen this morning, in the Sunday Telegraph in Britain, which is on the Soviet invasion, on the story of the 17th of September. And that will, a lot of people opening their newspaper in the morning, that will hopefully be an eye-opener for a lot of people. So these things are changing slowly. We are getting somewhere. So what we have to do, I suppose, is to keep doing what we're doing. So you all, those of you that do your genealogical research, and by extension, your sort of historical research around that, keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing it. Keep publicizing it as best you can. Write blogs, write books, publish your stories. We have to sort of tell ourselves that truth is on our side, that the truth will out. And crucially, as a final point, Vladimir Luzgin, for all his prosecutions, was right. It was an invasion. Thank you very much. Will you translate a question for me? No, of course.
Thank you. I've taken your book from the shelf about an hour ago, so I could only read a few pages. But I will have 2 questions to you. But I'd like to say that it's very good that in the 2nd chapter you mentioned the history and the contacts between Poland, Prussia, Germany, and Russia, because it's very important. People don't know why those 2 neighbors hated so much Poland.
Yes.
And what was about the territories and so on.
Yeah.
So I think it's very good.
Thank you. I like that
in
sort of question.
appendices, you are writing about three armies.
Yes.
But what I need in the future, when you will have the second edition of this book. I need numbers. Because if you are writing, for example, the Third Army, Russian Army, I don't know. Army
Numbers
is
of
not
men?
equal to army.
Numbers of men, you mean?
Now, how many people
Okay.
participated?
Okay.
If you say brigade, I don't know how many people there were. I am not a militarian, and
To be honest,
little people.
to be honest, I don't know either. I'm not a military
But
historian either.
Here you can find these numbers. Yes, it's very important to show the differences between those three armies:
That's
Polish,
very true.
German, and Russian.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
And I note your
Okay,
complaint.
thank you very much. I would
Thank
have
you.
more if I read your book, the whole one. Yeah. Next, what I have found, I looked that you mentioned the visit of Brian, Julian Brian.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that his son, Samuel Brian, was here in this house about 7-8 years ago. Now he is visiting Poland. I saw him on TV.
He was here last week, right?
Samuel Brian, exactly. And Kazimiera, who is mentioned here, she visited also this house about this. Samuel Brian was here. The next remark concerns the beginning and the provocation in Gleiwitz. You are writing about these people, prisoners who were dressed in.
No, that was Hochlinden. That's a misconception. So in Gleiwitz is only one Polish prisoner, who was Franciszek Koniok.
No. You are writing about the prisoners dressed in Polish uniforms.
That was at Hochlinden, is a different place.
No, in Gleiwitz. Also in Gleiwitz.
No, it's not. It's a misconception. So because it's been written about wrongly so often that it's almost become a truth in itself, and it's actually incorrect. So the Polish prisoners, where they have Polish prisoners dressed up in Polish uniforms who are then shot, that happens at a place called Hochlinden, which is a different provocation on the same night. But at Gleiwitz, there's only one Polish prisoner who was Franciszek Koniok. And he was none of them were in uniform.
And who attacked the radio in Gleiwitz?
The SS.
Who?
SS.
Dressed in?
No, not in uniforms.
And they dressed as civilians.
Dressed as civilians. Yeah, but there's a misconception.
Because
if you go back to the original sources on this, if you go to the German archives, if you go to the deposition of Helmut Naujoks, and he describes the whole process in great detail, and you can see how this story has developed a mythology of its own.
You wrote somewhere here about 6 prisoners. Sorry, I can't find now this fragment.
That was a different action on the same night.
Because I saw the Polish film. It was made about 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And there it was mentioned that Polish prisoners taken from the camps were taken to participate and as
in
the
Gleiwitz.
victims. So,
in Gleiwitz?
In Gleiwitz.
Yeah, so that's wrong.
It's wrong now.
That's wrong.
Maybe. The documents, there are more and more documents. And
so it's complicated. What has happened is that you have 3 main actions on the night of the 31st of August, all organized by the SS at 3 different places.
I will study it better.
The historical narrative that we kind of accept nowadays conflates those 3. It puts all of those 3 into one, and it says that there was an attack at Gleiwitz, and they had Polish prisoners in Polish uniforms who were machine gunned, and that actually is another action on the same night. So Gleiwitz is the most important action because that's the one where they tried to do a radio broadcast, but failed. But at Gleiwitz, they only had one Polish prisoner, who was Honiok, and none of them were in uniform. They didn't need to be in uniform because they were going to broadcast in Polish.
Anyhow, some people were dressed in the Polish uniforms.
That was at a different place.
Okay, but have you ever heard about that it was Schindler who prepared these uniforms?
Yeah.
Did you mention this?
I don't mention Schindler, no, but apparently, I mean, he was an Abwehr agent. There was a lot of Abwehr participation in these provocations. So it doesn't surprise me.
I saw it on the canal Planet. The film about it, that this famous Schindler who helped the Jews in Krakow, he prepared, but probably he didn't know what they were for. Probably.
Well, he's another one that's is a very ambivalent figure, actually, Schindler. Of course, he does have some sort of conversion to become a good man during the war.
Especially at the end of the war.
Yeah, but in the early phase of the war, he comes to Poland as an exploiter. He's a member of the Nazi Party, he's an agent of the Abwehr, and he comes to Krakow to take over the enamel factory as an exploiter of Polish labor and of Polish factories. So he's not a good man at the beginning of the war, but what's interesting about him is that he has this conversion, that he must have seen the reality of Nazi rule, and then he becomes a good man or a better man.
And the last remark and 2 questions. Yes, I'd like to know if you know that those people who were in Schleswig-Holstein, 225, I think, they weren't from the beginning when the Schleswig-Holstein was leaving the harbor, but they were taken from the another ship.
Yes.
You know about
yes,
it. But you
they were
didn't mention
Marines.
it. It's very interesting for people.
Well, the Schleswig-Holstein was already completely obsolete by 1939. It was a First World War battleship. It had fought at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and it was actually scheduled to be scuppered, to be destroyed in the mid-1930s. They were going to sink it. But it was kept on as a cadet training ship. So this was the capacity in which it was brought to Danzig at the end of August 1939, was on a friendship visit, but in its capacity as a cadet training ship.
Yeah, I know.
And as you say, well, you know, and as you say, it had a rendezvous, I think, with the battleship Schlesien, I think it was, out in the Baltic, and it had actually taken on, I think, 225 German Marines. So when it sails into the new port, the Novi port in Danzig, on that morning, and they're all waving. All the cadets are waving. Below decks are 225 heavily armed German Marines who are ready to make the land attack. So you're absolutely right.
But I'd like to say that this kind of small information, unimportant maybe for somebody, make history more interesting.
I think so. I think so.
Okay, but have you mentioned here in your book that Stutthof concentration camp has started to work in September 1939.
Yes.
Have you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay, because I am after 100 pages, not more. And the last question, sorry, that was, well, maybe later, because I have forgotten
maybe
what
later.
I wanted to ask. Thank you.
To pani sobie przypomni. Chciałam trochę skomplikować wątek ataku kawalerii na niemieckie czołgi. To jest bardzo popularny wątek, który wszedł do polskiej literatury jako forma krytyki, sanacji i międzywojnia. Wszyscy mamy w pamięci słowa Becka, te ostatnie, kiedy nie chciał oddać Niemcom Gdańska, że nie oddamy ani jednego guzika. Po wojnie w latach 50., 60. Kruczkowski pisze Lotną. Wielki obraz ataku polskiej kawalerii na czołgi. Wajda robi ten film i to jest pierwszy.
Attacking German tanks was created. Wajda made a film about it, and this image was very popular and well known in Poland. When Wajda made his film in 1959, we all love this film. When he made this film, Kanał, in 1959, we all love this film, but it was a critique of the Warsaw Rising. He was not the same Wajda who made Katyń or Man of Iron or Man of Marble. And of course, I'm saying this because in other countries, this myth may be present because of lack of knowledge. But in Poland, this narrative was introduced as a form of critique against the Sanacja government.
Of the Polish cavalry charging the tanks may have been a result of German propaganda or ignorance elsewhere, but that in Wajda's film, this was shown as a political criticism of the regime between the wars. Yes? So,
Yeah, it's true. That absolutely right.
Tak, to prawda, całkowita prawda, to zgadzam się z tym. Ten mit pojawił się w niemieckiej propagandzie po to, żeby
As being militarily, technologically, and crucially racially inferior to the Germans. Right? That's the origin of it. The origin of the story actually comes from an Italian war reporter who witnessed a battle, the aftermath of one of the battles on the Bzura, where there were a lot of horses in the battlefield, and he actually wrote a piece for the Corriere della Sera where the headline, which he probably wasn't responsible for, if you understand how newspapers work, he probably didn't write the headline, but the headline said horses against tanks. And that wasn't the piece itself is actually relatively sympathetic, but the headline was horses against tanks, or cavalry against tanks. And that's picked up by German propaganda, and they run with this, like they've got an external source that isn't their own, so they run with it and they refer back to this article, and it becomes the source of the myth. So that's the origin of it. But then you're absolutely right when you say that, in a sense, certainly the post-war communist authorities become complicit in the myth because it's a useful way of damning the pre-war regime and say that these people were foolish and they should have done things differently, and it's a useful stick with which to beat them. And again, the problem that the Polish narrative has is that there's nobody, effectively until 1989, that is willing to tell the truth about 1939, right? We know the Soviets are never going to tell the truth about 39. The British and the French, again, I don't think it's a conspiracy, but they're consumed with their own story of the war. They're not particularly interested in Poland. The Germans are not going to start telling the story of 1939 because they went on to bigger crimes. They had bigger crimes to expiate, to say sorry for. And even communist Poland is not going to tell a true story of 1939. So, in a sense, we had to wait until 1989 for anything to come out that was even vaguely correct on this. And that's part of the problem. That's why the mythology has come up and taken hold in the way that it has, is because of this collusion of silence. So, but you're absolutely right. And Vaida was part of that. He's part the brilliant stuff he did later. You know, Kanał and Katyn and all the rest of it. But in Lotna, in that early film, I think it was his first film, you know, he's basically taking the political line that he's told to take. He had to as a young filmmaker. So he does this brilliant scene of the Polish cavalry charging tanks. But it's a myth.
Can I just, on behalf of everybody, say thank you. You know, I think I echo the sentiments of the room. Very, very engaging, very interesting talk. If I would just ask you a question. You talked about the misinformation, or to coin a newer term, fake news, about September the 1st, September the 17th. And as we know, a lot of the liberated Poles ended up in Italy, the Italian campaign, with Cassino. I think there is a myth, I may be mistaken, that Cassino was the final battle, and yet Anders' army went on to greater achievements.
Yes.
Or equally great achievements, Ancona, Bologna, you know, but we don't seem to popularize that.
No.
And I'm just wondering, do you think there's a subtle disinformation movement about that?
Against Poland?
Yes, very much so.
I'm not Polish. I don't have any Polish forebears. So I'm sympathetic. I've studied Polish history. I come here a lot. So I was described the other day by a lady in an audience, she was Polish, and she said, are you sure you're not Polish? And I said, yes, I'm pretty sure I'm not Polish. And she said, well, you are an honorary Pole. So I'll take that as a compliment. But no, I'm not Polish. But I think, and viewing it from the outside, I think there's a sort of a trait, if you like, in the sort of Polish psyche, which tends to sort of, conjure up this idea of the outside world being a big conspiracy against the Poles. And I think we have to kind of try and get away from that. I know you have such a painful history. 20th century is beyond compare in terms of the amount of pain that it inflicts on Poland. And I fully appreciate that that has the capacity to provoke sometimes these extreme or perhaps odd positions. But even going back beyond that, go back into the partitions and the pain of all of that, the risings, everything. I get it. I understand. But I don't really see this idea of a conspiracy. I just think the outside world is kind of obsessed with its own things. It has a fundamentally sort of parochial view of history. So the Americans obsess about Pearl Harbor. We obsess about D-Day. We obsess about the Battle of Britain. And actually what we need to try and do, both as historians and as producers of history and as consumers of history, is to be more ecumenical, be more sort of open-minded about taking on other parts of other narratives. Because it's not enough anymore, really, to just keep banging on about the dam busters and D-Day and think we understand World War II, because we don't. And certainly our first ally, i.e. the Poles, who are standing next to British forces all the way through the war in every single theatre, which still, I think, precious few British people fully appreciate. That story is one that we really need to hitch to our own, to attach to our own, and they should be mentioned at every turn. And as I say that as a non-Pole. So I think I would fight shy a little bit. I would resist that sort of conspiratorial narrative. I think it is just a sort of parochial mindset, which we're all guilty of, and we all have to try and get over it.
Roger, are you good for a few more questions? Because I think there is, maybe what I'll do is I'll ask, before we pass it to our eminent co-authority here, I might, in all kindness, I just ask for a show of hands who has questions, and then we will kind of proceed in. Can I do it from left to right? So first Andrzej, and then Chris, Roma, Maciej i pani na końcu, jeżeli pani pozwoli. Abyśmy doszli do końca. Andrew, I'll pass to you first. I don't think we'll need a translation.
Thanks, Roger. Press of the 17th of September invasion in world press, I recall seeing on eBay, possibly one of the big publishers, and it had Russian troops in Poland. Again, I wish I bought the item on eBay, but what was the world press response to this? Was it, a feature, but again, it had no standalone narrative to sort of build over time, or, was it kind of featured? Sadly, I haven't had time to read the book, but...
well, I'm sure you will. No, you're right. Your question kind of answers itself in a way, because it's part of this both deliberately manufactured confusion and just confusion, So you're in the middle of the war, the Germans have effectively attacked Poland, we know that, and that's being reported in the press. And then suddenly the next minute, Red Army is in Poland, and a lot of, you don't have the immediate access to information that we have now. I think we very often project back and imagine that there was at least any access to information. There just wasn't. In eastern Poland, there was very little at all. So it would have taken days to get out. So the Western press is dependent probably on Soviet press releases. And if you're lucky, they might have incorporated something from the Poles. But even that is questionable. So by the 17th, certainly the government is on its heels and is basically trying to get down to the Romanian bridgehead. So how much, the Poles are actually able to give a counter-narrative to what's coming from Moscow is questionable. On 17th of September. So in a sense that answers your question. It was just one of confusion, and of course that confusion is not helped or is deepened by the conflicting Soviet narratives about saying that they're coming in to liberate and that Poland has collapsed and all of this. So it's quite obvious that, like you said, the headline would have said, Red Army in Poland. It doesn't say Red Army invades Poland. Right? Because that actually means that they know something that's going on. They're just saying the Red Army's in Poland. The subtext is, we don't know what's going on. That was the truth.
So the domestic sense spread, replicated in global media.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just in that, with that lack of information, all you can say is the Red Army is in Poland because Stalin's propaganda bureaus told us it is. That's all it could be.
Yeah, thanks.
So it's a very effective, disinformation campaign as well, and which exploits the fact that there's very, very little hard information available on the ground.
Okay, thank you, Roger. And next will be Chris.
Thank you, Roger. Enjoyed your presentation. Could you describe, was there an aha moment? Was there an epiphany, however many years it took you to write the book, where you said, that's wrong, I need to find out more about this and write a book? Thank you.
That's a difficult one, because this is, I studied Polish history. I studied, a student of Norman Davies going back into the 90s. I researched for Norman Davies for a long time. I worked on his Rising 44 book on the Warsaw Rising, for example. So I've kind of always been in the loop. So I don't think there's a time where I sort of came to this and went, oh, crikey, that's what happened. Because I kind of always dimly knew about it. So for me, it was, the broad narrative of what happens. September 17th wasn't something I needed to learn the date, certainly. I kind of knew that. I needed to learn the detail, which is still very hard to find out in many cases, because there's very, very little, comparatively little actually, even in Polish. The main sort of framework of it was pretty clear to me. So that in that sense, there wasn't an aha moment. But there's a few places like, that phrase that I use. I say that the Germans are committing race war in the West and the Soviets are committing class war in the East. I mean, that's but that's been picked up by the press in the UK, which is quite nice. But it's quite a neat encapsulation of what was going on. And so, like, for example, when I sort of thought of that, when that penny dropped, I thought, that's really quite a neat way of explaining what's going on. So that was a little aha for me, just to sort of, when you can tie it up in that way very neatly, then that's quite satisfying. But the broad scope of it is all kind of much more almost self-evident in a way. And my previous book was on the Nazi-Soviet Pact anyway. So that I was pretty much immersed in all of this area and this period. I have been probably for 8 or 9 years over those 2 books. Okay.
Can I pass the next question to Roma? Roma King-Michniewicz. You must speak in the microphone.
I only have to share something. Of course, I enjoyed. I only want to share something, not a question. I worked at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles, and we hosted VIDA for a lecture of 3 hours. He was talking about the Polish film, kind of the way they produce it and comparing it with American. And then somebody raised up a hand and said, well, was it true that the Poles the cavalry went against the tanks? He said, oh, that was very strategic. I don't think many of the people get it. But the thing is, when the cavalry went towards the tanks, they parted and they went behind because the piechota, infantry was behind the tanks, and the heads rolled because the cavalry had swords.
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom. Yeah. And so it was more effective than shooting a rifle. So he said, unfortunately, a lot of people didn't get it. Right. But that's what he meant, to show that it really happened, but it was very strategically beneficial.
Okay.
They didn't lose as many men.
Right. Can I sort of respond to that? I think that's a little bit of him justifying himself there, I must say, because everything I've read into this, of course, I know it came from him, but I think that's maybe him justifying his own. Everything I've read about the Polish cavalry, they're actually very effective in 39. They fight dismounted. They don't generally charge anything. They would charge infantry. If they can see infantry isolated, they would charge, and there's a couple of instances where they do that, and they do it tremendously effectively. Yeah, but you can see the problem of being on a horse charging a tank with a machine gun because you're a very big target which is very easily hit with a tank's machine gun. So, and crucially, they were actually, I've heard from other people actually saying that they were even forbidden to charge against armour. So they fought dismounted. They had you can see there's a picture of the artillery piece, the Bofors 37, which they used to tow around with them, and they would use these artillery pieces. They had these anti-tank rifles, the Uruguay, which was very effective against German tanks in 1939. So actually they fight in a completely different way from how the stereotype tells us they fought in 1939. And they only would charge, as I said, against infantry. So the instance where this, there's a famous sort of stereotypical battle at Crianti on the first day, which is often raised. This is one that's the example that's often given, where they say that the Polish cavalry charged the tanks. It's more complicated than that, because the Polish cavalry charged infantry initially, very successfully, win the field, and then they're countercharged by German armour, right, and destroyed effectively. So this is the real story of Crianti. So it's not a cavalry charge against tanks. So I think we have to sort of understand this in its complexity and the sort of this is what I always say about history. We have to embrace the complexity of it. And the simplified narrative is almost always wrong. And I appreciate that's what Vida said. I don't want to contradict you on that, but I think he might have been trying to justify himself.
I think, Roger, as you say, there's many different sides of all of these incidents, and I think you pick up maybe one to, as you're saying, to emphasize the point. So I think that both those things could be true. As you're saying, the horses were charging the infantry and bypassing the tanks, right? And that's not totally inconsistent with charging infantry, but it might have been hard to get around the tanks, and usually the infantry was quite far behind the tanks, I think, as well. I'm not a military historian, but will you allow us to pass maybe to the next question? Because I want to move on to make sure that we have a chance for the final question from our learned friend in the front. Maciej?
Thank you, Roger, for your book. I have two short questions. You told us about why Russia attacked Poland. What do you think? What's your opinion that it was a Stalin revenge because Poland won in 1920? Mm-hmm.
First one?
Psychological possibility.
Yeah.
And second question. And what are British opinion now in September after the premiere your book, this book?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll take the second question first because it's the sort of shorter one. It seems to have gone well so far. I mean, these things take time. You have to wait for reviews to come out and so on. But the Polish embassy in London has been very good. They got behind it, and we had a big launch event, and social media's been very active and so on. It's had a few reviews already. The Economist and the Times have both reviewed it, both very positively. It's been mentioned, like I said, that I mentioned this op-ed opinion piece in the Telegraph, and that mentions it as well in a very favourable manner. So all of the sort of the smoke signals so far have been very positive about the book. But the caveat that I would mention, the counterpoint to that, is that it's very difficult to essentially sell a new narrative to the reading public because they go through the history shelves and they go, oh, that one's about D-Day, I'll read that. Because I know about D-Day. And they would look at a book and say, that's Poland 39, I don't know anything about that, so I won't read it. So this is the problem. You have this sort of, confirmation bias almost, that people just read the stuff that they know about already. And they're very often not willing to read something that's new. So we have to wait and see. This is a bit like, as I keep saying, it's a bit like trying to turn around a supertanker. Trying to change a historical narrative takes years. And I can't do it on my own. So I need readers, I need commentators, I need journalists and other historians to help with that process. But if we don't start and we don't try, we won't succeed. So we're trying. Okay. The first question about Stalin, this idea that September 17th is a revenge, in a way, I mean, you're right, because there's two aspects here. The first aspect is that, Battle of Warsaw, August 1920, is in itself symbolic of the Soviet Union's humiliation, of Russia's humiliation by extension. I know Stalin's not Russian, but he still acts like a Russian nationalist effectively. So this is symbolic of Russia's post-war humiliation. Right? It not only has Russia lost these swathes of territory that Moscow and the Kremlin thought would be its forever, in Poland, in the Baltic states, Bessarabia and so on, Finland as well. On top of that, their attempt to export their odious ideology westward in 1920 fails, and it fails spectacularly outside Warsaw. So this is symbolic of a wider humiliation. So that's one point. So of course, Stalin and the Soviet Union is a revisionist power. We know that. They want to tear up Versailles just as much as Hitler wants to tear up Versailles. And they view Poland as almost the personification of Versailles. So as soon as they find common ground between Berlin and Moscow, it's pretty obvious who the victim is going to be. It's going to be Poland first of all. Right? That's one broad point. And then on a specific point to that question, it's very clear that Stalin, through the 1930s, is very keen to sort of exorcise, as what you do with a bad memory, the ghost of the Polish-Soviet War. So he was supposedly responsible for various failings during that campaign on the southwestern front, and he had, certainly in the purges of the 1937-38, a lot of the people targeted, senior military personnel who was targeted in the purges, were people who had been his Confederates and his superiors in 1938. So there's a suspicion, I think probably more than a suspicion, that Stalin is actually kind of cleaning up and making sure there's no one there to point the finger and say that he did wrong in 1920. And that's part of the motivation behind the purges. Right, so that's quite plausible, I think. So in that sense, there is a personal aspect that he wants to avenge the defeat of 1920, both domestically and internationally. So it's both things, I think. So premise, absolutely right.
Okay, Roger, thank you. We're in the home stretch. I think I promised the last question to our learned friend.
She's now read 200 pages.
Pani Ewa. Eva, she's read a bit more of your book and has some pointed questions for you.
Well, I'd like to ask you about the information about the betrayal of our friends. I was sure I would find it in the chapter about absent friends, in the chapter number 6.
Yes.
It consists of 50 pages, maybe I didn't notice, but please tell me, where can I find it in your book? I mean the information about the secret treaty between Great Britain and France concerning decision that they won't help Poland in their fight. And neither France nor Great Britain didn't want to keep the treaties about this help.
Yeah.
It was Abbeville?
Abbeville. Yeah.
Which date? And where can I find it?
No, it's not
because
in the
in
index.
this chapter about this absent friends,
Yeah.
Maybe it should be here.
Yeah.
I couldn't find it.
It is there.
It is there.
It is
but
definitely there.
Probably, maybe.
It definitely,
50
Abbeville,
pages
absolutely.
is, well, I just was looking through and I couldn't find it.
It's at the end of that chapter. There's a whole section.
The end of the
Abbeville.
chapter, yes?
Yeah, the end of that chapter, starting page 178.
An English version,
Only
but
one version.
I have Polish version only.
Right, it's the
168.
last section of Absent Friends. Sorry.
And Abbeville is mentioned here?
Sorry?
Abbeville is mentioned.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Yes, 295.
295.
295. Is that right?
Because it was, and the date, where it was, when it was?
Hang on. Abbeville is the 12th, I think.
Roger, could you say something about that for the rest of us?
Yes, sure.
Following what...
Yeah, the British and the French obviously had both made military alliances or military arrangements with Poland to defend Poland. The British had been pretty vague about what they would do. They just said they would support Poland in the event of her attack. The French had been much more specific in what was known as the Gamelin-Kasprzycki Agreement, which I think was in May of 1939, where the French had committed to sending the bulk of their forces, that was the phrase, across the German frontier in the event of an attack by Germany. So there were some concrete commitments and some less concrete commitments in terms of that arrangement. The British guarantee of march, of course, is reinforced by the Anglo-Polish military agreement of the 25th of August. And then, of course, Poland is invaded, and both Britain and France wring their hands and say, oh God, basically the line that they had tried to draw in the sand to try and deter Hitler had failed. The problem that they had, again, I don't subscribe to the idea that this is some sort of conspiracy, which is a sort of common trope. Well, not common, but you do hear it. British and the French effectively, with a combination of ineptitude, great power, arrogance, and to a certain extent, the tail end of appeasement as a mentality, basically had no plan B. They had no plan B that in the event that Hitler doesn't cease and desist, which is what they want him to do, what would they actually do in response? So the British certainly don't really have a plan B at all. The French are much more politically torn in terms of acting in France's name. So that's more difficult for them to sort of square. And then, so British and French, lots of warm words towards Poland and lots of words of support in the opening days of the war. Of course, they declare war on the 3rd of September because Hitler refuses to withdraw troops. But beyond the warm words, very, very little is done. So there's a very, very weak excursion, a French excursion into the Saarland, which starts on the 7th, I think it is, from memory, 7th of September, which is, it doesn't even warrant the use of the word invasion because it's more like a expedition. The British bomb some sort of naval military targets, places like Wilhelmshaven, but they resist actually bombing Germany itself. They don't bomb any sort of civilian targets. They drop leaflets on German towns to try and dissuade the German people from attacking Poland, which is ludicrous. And there's a wonderful scene that I mentioned in the book, which is from a cabinet meeting, the British cabinet, where the Minister for Air is asked whether there is a plan for the RAF to bomb German arms depots in the Black Forest in southwestern Germany. And his reaction, I think, rather sums up British attitude at this time, because his reaction is that he says, goodness me, don't you know that that's private property? I kid you not. So the run-up, this is all the run-up to Abbeville, which is on the 12th, which is an inter-allied conference between the British and the French. I'll find it. It is there. An inter-allied conference at Abbeville, where effectively that is the point at which the narrative shifts, and they stop expressing this sort of commitment to Poland, and they start saying, well, we'll rebuild Poland after the war. So this is the moment at which the decision has obviously been made that they're not going to do anything. So that's the final abandonment of Poland, is at Abbeville.
Much deep in that history. Roger, I'll permit myself maybe two quick questions, or one question and just a comment. The question first, you spoke a fair bit about the disinformation and the confusion that was being sown, and I think you also alluded to Russia has continued this line. In fact, to mark September the 1st, the 80th anniversary, I believe that we've found at least 5 or 6 letters to the editor from Russian ambassadors in different countries, Brazil and England and other places, saying, let's just get the story straight. And they were almost verbatim identical letters, so they probably had some help writing them. I was just wondering whether you had come across this latest wave and whether there were any responses from anybody else, or whether it's nonsensical to respond and better to just ignore. So that's maybe my question to deal with, today's kind of propaganda campaigns about this. And then the second, maybe it's maybe more like just an observation, or many people here are listening to the translators and are hearing Anastasia's voice. And Anastasia has been translating for these conferences for 6 years now. I have to confess, because I speak both Polish and English, I don't hear her voice anymore. In the beginning, she would translate on stage together with the person. Unfortunately, that took too long, we discovered, because everything had to be said twice. So before we sort of finish the conference, I did want to thank Anastasia and Renata for all the work that they do. But I believe that Anastasia has also worked closely with you on a couple of books. I wanted to just ask you what that experience has been like. So that's the two questions.
Yeah, the first one, I'll come to Anastasia in a minute. The first one, yeah, there has been, I think, there's been a sort of a campaign almost, I think, in Russian media circles to try and, I think the only phrase you can use is to try and seize control back of the narrative of 1939, because they've fundamentally lost that narrative. More people now are talking about the Nazi-Soviet Pact in genuine, honest terms. Books like mine and others. I mean, Sławomir Dębski, who's here from PiSM here in Warsaw, also wrote a brilliant book on the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So I think they're in danger of almost losing control of that narrative, because the truth is coming out. This is what I was talking about. So increasingly, the output of Russian propaganda becomes increasingly ridiculous, because they're sort of, increasingly shrill and rather ridiculous. I mean, the most recent one was actually trying to blame Poland for the outbreak of World War II, which is just preposterous. I mean, all of us in this room know that that is absolute nonsense. And I mean, my sort of take on this, I don't think there's any point in responding to it. There are enough people that do. I mean, I'm sort of quite active on Twitter, for example, and on Twitter, you can just have a go at sort of Sergei Lavrov and just say, "Don't be ridiculous." I tweeted back to him yesterday. I said, "Have you been on the vodka again?" Because he tweeted something ridiculous. And I think you just have to ridicule them, because it is ridiculous. There's no point engaging in a proper argument, because it's just preposterous what they come out with. And I think the root of it is because they're losing control of the narrative. The truth is coming out and they don't like it, and they're unwilling to confront their own history. And I know a lot of us here will have the same animus against the Germans, particularly in the perspective of World War II. But look at what modern Germany has done in terms of coming to terms with its own past. It's absolutely exemplary. And if only Russia could rouse itself to have one eye looking honestly at its own past, it would make the world a happier place. But they're not. They're not yet there. But we have to hope that one day they will get there. But they're not there at the moment. So that's question one. Anastasia, yes. I mean, we actually have... There's quite a sort of a link to the whole Kresy-Syberia thing, because when I came, I think I was promoting Devil's Alliance, and I came and spoke 5 years ago. I think it was 5 years ago. And that was Anastasia. That's the first time I met Anastasia, and she translated for me on stage, like you mentioned. And I thought she was very good. I was very impressed. I then came, that was when I had the UK edition of Devil's Alliance. I came back the following year, came back to Warsaw, when the Polish edition of Devil's Alliance came out, and I still had her card, so I contacted my publisher and said, this lady's very, very good. And they used her for the interpreting then when I did the press for the Polish edition. And on the back of that, again, I thought she was fantastic, so we kept in touch, and then I engaged her as my researcher for this book. So she's been intimately involved in this one. She's done a fantastic job, and she's behind the scenes now, still doing a fantastic job. So, yes, big round of applause for our translators, particularly Anastasia. Thank you. Thank you.
Roger, thank you very much for your repeat performance.
It
was 2014, you're right, 5 years ago.
I think so, yeah.
Devil's Alliance. We have a break now. We have half an hour, after which we will have a singer from the Polish army, Wojciech Bardewski. And then we will have Roma King's film about her experiences, the footsteps in the snow. Najpierw śpiewak, bo musi nas opuścić. Musimy być elastyczni. So we have half an hour for a break. Please be back at 4 o'clock? 4 o'clock. 20 minutes. Back at 4 o'clock. Yeah? 23 minutes. Niestety oni zmieniliśmy. Czasami z czasem się dostać.
Dobra, nie ma gadania. Niech śpiewa.